There was a kitchen that ran before the rest of the house was awake. It ran on cast iron and saved grease and whatever the smokehouse or the garden or the corner market had given up that week. The breakfast it produced was not a meal in the modern sense. It was a calculation. Enough protein to last until noon, enough warmth to move a body through cold weather and hard work, enough care compressed into a plate to say something that nobody in that kitchen was going to say out loud. These 41 breakfasts came out of that world. Black households across the American South and the cities they migrated to through the 1960s. Some of these dishes went when the neighborhoods that held them were demolished. Some are in notebooks that haven't been opened in 40 years. A few of them will stop you when you understand what they actually cost to make and what they produced anyway. Entry 41. Crackling bread and chicory coffee. Cracklings were not an ingredient. They were what happened after the hog was rendered and nothing was left to discard. The crisp, salted pieces of fried pork skin folded into cornbread batter before sunrise and slid into the oven whole. What came out had weight and structure and pockets of rendered fat that no factory process has replicated. Alongside it, coffee cut with chicory, a blend that spread through the Black South partly because chicory stretched what you had, and partly because the flavor it made was genuinely preferred, slightly bitter, slightly earthy underneath the coffee. People chose it after they could afford not to. That combination, crackling bread and chicory coffee before the windows went light, connected the person eating it to a smokehouse tradition that was already a century old when the 1960s began. Entry 40. Biscuits with streak of lean gravy. Streak of lean was salt-cured pork with a stripe of lean meat running through the fat. Not quite bacon, not quite fatback. You fried it in cast iron and made the gravy from what it left behind. Milk, flour, black pepper, drippings. And the result was white and thick and carried the smokiness of the cured pork all the way through. Poured over biscuits that came out of a wood-burning oven with a slight char on the bottom and a tall, flaky interior. Streak of lean was a pantry staple the way flour was a pantry staple, because it was the beginning of several things, and the gravy it produced was built to carry a person until midday. Households kept it the same way they kept salt, not as a luxury, as infrastructure. Entry 39. Grits with pot liquor. Pot liquor is the liquid left after collard greens or mustard greens or turnip greens have slow cooked for hours with a ham hock. In any black household of the early 1960s worth its salt, that liquid was saved. It was dark and deeply flavored and rich with what had cooked out of the greens and the bone. And the following morning, it came out of the icebox, got heated, and went directly over a bowl of stone-ground grits. No butter needed, no cheese. The pot liquor was the seasoning and the sauce and the nutrition all at once. This was not a compromise breakfast. It was a deliberate one. The people who made it understood what was in that liquid before nutritional science had the language to explain it. Entry 38. Neck bone broth as a morning drink. Pork neck bones simmered overnight in water with onion, black pepper, and a bay leaf produced a broth that was in a mug on the stove before anyone else in the house had opened their eyes. Not in a bowl, a mug. Drunk standing, the way coffee was drunk, while the rest of the morning organized itself. The broth warmed the joints and settled the stomach and did something for a body about to perform hard physical labor that no cold cereal was going to replicate. What the wellness industry sells today for $8 a carton, the Black Southern kitchen made from bones the butcher gave away for nearly nothing. The preparation predated the marketing by about 100 years. Entry 36. Fried fatback with cornmeal mush. Fatback was pure white salt-cured pork fat, fried crisp in its own rendering. Mush was grits run thin, stirred longer with a wooden spoon until smooth and almost pourable, served in a bowl with the fried fatback laid across the top or broken up and stirred in. The fat from the pork melted down through the mush until the whole bowl was flavored through. Nothing was hidden in this breakfast. Nothing was processed. It cost almost nothing to make, and it filled a child until the afternoon, which was the entire point. The children who ate fried fatback and cornmeal mush before school in 1962 did not think of it as unusual. It was Tuesday. Entry 36. Souse meat and head cheese on bread. Both came from the head of the hog. Both involved slow cooking until the meat fell from the bone, then pressing the mixture into its own gelatin and slicing it cold. They were not the same thing. Head cheese was mild, set firm, eaten on white bread with mustard. Souse had vinegar and hot pepper worked directly into it, sharper, more acidic, built to wake you up. The distinction mattered to the people who made them. Both represented the same logic: the head of the hog, the cut nobody else wanted, transformed by patience and seasoning into something that tasted like it cost considerably more than it did. Eaten before sunrise on a piece of white bread. Just Tuesday.
Entry 35. Chitterlings prep as morning work. What this entry describes is not chitterlings as a finished dish. It is the cleaning of chitterlings, the small intestines of the hog, as a parallel morning activity. The cleaning required hours of cold salted water and repeated rinsing, and in many households, it began while breakfast was already on the stove. Grits in one pot, biscuits in the oven, chitterlings at the sink. The women doing this work were managing two timelines at once, and both of them were running before the children came downstairs. The black kitchen morning of the early 1960s was not a single task, it was a system. Breakfast was the visible part of it. The rest of what was being prepared for later in the day ran alongside it, unseen, before anyone else in the house was dressed. Entry 34. Sweet potato hash with pork sausage. The sweet potato entered the black kitchen morning not as a novelty, but as a permanent resident. Cubed and fried in cast iron alongside crumbled pork sausage, seasoned at home with sage and red pepper and black pepper, not purchased in a casing, but bought by the pound from the butcher, until the potato edges caramelized and the sausage browned through. One pan, no sides required. The color alone was something. Deep orange against dark brown, produced in a skillet that cost less than $1 and fed 4 people on ingredients that together ran about the same. A pound of bulk sausage and 3 sweet potatoes. That was the math. The result looked like it had been designed, which in a sense it had, over decades of mornings that knew exactly what they were doing. Entry 33. Sweet potato biscuits. Mashed cooked sweet potato folded directly into biscuit dough. Flour, lard, buttermilk, salt changed what a biscuit could do. It gave the dough color, a warm orange that came out of the oven looking deliberate. It gave a natural sweetness that meant the biscuit needed nothing else to be complete. It gave moisture that extended shelf life, which in a household where nothing was discarded mattered practically. Sweet potato biscuits were typically made on Saturday from leftover sweet potatoes and appeared on the Sunday table alongside the scratch biscuits. The children always reached for the orange ones first. That preference was not accidental. It was the product of a grandmother who understood her audience and had planned accordingly. Entry 32. Leftover rice fried with salt pork and green onion. Cold rice from the night before, slightly dried, clumped, is the correct texture for this preparation, though no one in these kitchens called it fried rice. You rendered salt pork in the skillet, added the cold rice, pressed it flat, let the bottom crust, turned it, added chopped green onion and black pepper. A scrambled egg folded in toward the end if one was available. The result was substantive and deeply savory, and the smell of it moving through a screen door on a Sunday morning was not a smell that stayed inside. It announced the household. The economy of the preparation, last night's starch, a small amount of cured pork, what the garden had left, was invisible in the finished dish. That invisibility was the skill. Entry 31. Salt mackerel and grits. Salt mackerel came down from the shelf whole, preserved in heavy brine, and went into cold water the night before.
You change the water at least once through the soaking to pull the salt back gradually. In the morning, the soaked fish went into a skillet in a little oil until the skin crisped and the flesh flaked, and the kitchen filled with a smell that was powerful and specific and not apologetic about either quality. Served alongside stone-ground grits with butter. The intensely savory, slightly mineral fish against the mild, creamy grits required no improvement. Salt mackerel and grits moved north from the Carolinas and Georgia and Florida with the Great Migration and appeared on breakfast tables in cities where the ingredients were harder to find, but not impossible. The overnight soak was the part that required planning. The rest took 15 minutes. Entry 30. Stewed tomatoes and grits. Fresh tomatoes in summer, canned through the winter, cooked down slow with a little sugar to cut the acid, a little salt pork for depth, a little onion, until the result was somewhere between a sauce and a stew. Poured over grits cooked with enough butter to make them shine. The combination works because the acidity of the tomato cuts the richness of the butter, and the grits absorb the liquid from the tomatoes, and the salt pork gives the whole thing a savory bottom that holds it together. These are not complicated interactions. They are the reason this breakfast appeared on tables from Mississippi through the Carolinas for decades without anyone needing to explain why. It was arrived at by repetition. The repetition continued because the result was correct.
Entry number 29. Salmon croquettes with white gravy. Canned pink salmon mixed with cracker crumbs, egg, onion, and black pepper formed into patties and fried until the exterior was golden and the interior stayed soft and flaky. The white gravy, milk, flour, butter, black pepper, went over the top. This was a staple in Black households from the Deep South to Detroit and Pittsburgh and Baltimore because canned salmon was affordable, available, and in competent hands produced something that bore no resemblance to its price tag. A can of salmon, a sleeve of crackers, 2 eggs fed a family of 4 with biscuits alongside. The white gravy was the step that moved it from a fried patty to a full plate. That step cost almost nothing and changed everything about how the meal sat. Entry 28. Country ham with red-eye gravy. Country ham was dry cured for months, sometimes over a year, until the flesh was dense and salty all the way through. Sliced thin and fried in a dry cast iron pan until the edges went almost black. Then coffee, strong, black, poured directly into the hot pan with the drippings. It hissed and steamed and lifted everything the pan had collected into a thin, dark, savory liquid with a coffee bitterness riding underneath the fat. That was red-eye gravy. Not thick, not white, poured over a split biscuit or over grits. Country ham was expensive relative to other cured pork cuts, which meant this breakfast marked a morning that had been prepared for. The coffee in the pan was not a trick, it was the technique. And it was the right one. Entry number 27. Cornbread and buttermilk. Cold buttermilk poured over crumbled leftover cornbread in a tall glass was a legitimate breakfast in Black households of the 1960s South and in the Northern households where Southern grandmothers had carried their habits with them. Not a snack, breakfast. Eaten with a spoon at the kitchen table while the curtains were still orange from the morning sun. The buttermilk was cold and tangy and slightly thick. The cornbread softened and swelled in it. The combination required nothing else and cost almost nothing to assemble. In households where food was not wasted and leftovers were not discarded, this was what yesterday's cornbread became. The people who grew up eating it did not experience it as a compromise. It was just what was in the glass.
Entry 26. Hominy, not grits. The distinction was understood clearly in the Black Southern kitchen of the 1960s and has since been largely lost. Grits come from dried corn that has been ground. Hominy comes from dried corn soaked in an alkaline solution, traditionally lye made from wood ash, that transforms the corn chemically, releasing nutrients unavailable in plain dried corn. This process, called nixtamalization, is thousands of years old. The result is a swollen, slightly chewy kernel with an earthier, more complex flavor than plain corn. Canned hominy fried in a skillet with bacon fat and black pepper until the edges crisped was a breakfast side that occupied a completely different register than grits. The people who kept both in the kitchen knew why. That knowledge is rarer now than it should be. Entry 25. Hog maw hash. Hog maw is the stomach of the pig, cleaned and slow cooked with onion and seasoning until tender, then diced and fried the next morning in a skillet with potato and bell pepper. It is not a dish that announces itself modestly. The texture is specific, more resistance than most breakfast meats, less than you'd expect, and the flavor is deeply savory without being gamey when the preparation is done correctly. This was the breakfast of households that wasted nothing and built no apology around that fact. The logic that produced hog maw hash is the same logic that produced most of the entries on this list. The cut nobody else was using, handled with enough patience and skill to become something worth sitting down to. The patience is the recipe. Entry 24. Molasses and butter on hoe cakes. Hoe cakes were cornmeal, water, salt, and sometimes a little flour, cooked in a thin film of oil or bacon fat on a griddle or directly on the flat surface of a wood-burning stove. Crispy at the edges, soft in the center, irregular in shape because no mold was used. Butter went on while the cake was hot enough to melt it on contact. Then sorghum, molasses poured from the glass bottle in a slow amber stream. The combination, savory cornmeal, rich butter, bittersweet molasses, was one of the foundational flavor experiences of the Black Southern breakfast table. It required almost nothing to make. It produced something that the person eating it remembered for the rest of their life. Those two facts coexisted without contradiction in every kitchen that made it. Entry 23. Boiled peanuts before school. Raw peanuts simmered for hours in heavily salted water until the shells softened and the nuts inside became tender and almost creamy, a flavor entirely unlike roasted peanuts, nothing like peanut butter, something that exists only in this preparation. A pot started the night before, sat warm on the back of the stove, and was available in the morning. Children ate them at the kitchen table before school, cracking the soft shells with their fingers, and the repetitive, meditative quality of the eating was itself a kind of morning quiet. Boiled peanuts as a morning food is not a tradition that appears in formal accounts of Southern foodways. It was a pot on the stove that happened to be there when breakfast was being assembled, and that was enough. Entry 22. Dried bean soup reheated. The pot of navy beans or pinto beans cooked the night before with a ham hock, broken down into a thick, creamy, intensely savory broth, was reheated in the morning and poured over cornbread or eaten from a bowl with white bread alongside. This was breakfast. Not a repurposed dinner, not a compromise, a deliberate morning meal that delivered protein and warmth and depth of flavor in a form that kept a working body functional until the afternoon. The instinct that categorizes soup as unsuitable for morning is a product of marketing, not nutrition. The women who reheated the bean pot knew something the cereal manufacturers were spending considerable money to make people forget. Entry 21. Crackers and cane syrup. Cane syrup, thick, dark, intensely sweet, distinct from molasses in its higher sweetness and slightly thinner body, poured over saltine crackers, was a breakfast in millions of black households through the 1960s. You dipped the cracker, or you poured the syrup directly over a small pile and let it pool, and you ate it with coffee or with a glass of whole milk. Children ate it. Grandparents ate it. It was not a compromised breakfast. It was a preferred one. The sweetness of the syrup against the salt of the cracker is a combination the snack food industry has been engineering toward for 50 years without matching what a pantry shelf and 30 seconds produced in 1964. The simplicity was not a limitation, it was the point.
Entry 20.
Pan-fried calf liver with onions and grits. Calf liver sliced thin, dredged in seasoned flour, cooked in cast iron until the outside was brown and the inside still barely pink, with onions slow cooked in the same pan until soft and sweet, laid across the top. Alongside, grits. Liver was inexpensive and available and is among the most nutritionally dense foods that exist. Black grandmothers in the 1960s made it on weekday mornings, not as a special occasion, but as a practical one. They understood before the science explained it that the people eating this breakfast had the energy to do the work required of them. The people who grew up eating liver before school remember it clearly. The people who didn't are often skeptical. Skepticism is the wrong response. Entry 19, liver pudding on toast. Liver pudding was pork liver browned fine with onion and seasoning and enough fat to make it spreadable, packed into a loaf, sliced cold, and spread on toast like butter. It was a Southern tradition with roots in German and Scots-Irish Appalachian food culture that crossed into Black Southern cooking through the shared poverty of the rural South, where everyone was working with the same hog and the same hunger. The flavor was rich and savory and slightly mineral. The toast gave it crunch and contrast. It cost nearly nothing to make and tasted like it cost considerably more, which describes the underlying logic of most of the entries on this list. A cup of chicory coffee alongside and a fried egg if one was available, and the morning was handled. Entry 18, fried corn with scrambled eggs. Fresh corn cut from the cob in summer, canned corn in winter, cooked in a skillet with butter and bacon fat and salt and sugar until the kernel edges caramelized and the sweetness deepened. Mixed with scrambled eggs cooked low and slow, stirred constantly until just barely set. The caramelized corn and the soft eggs together made a breakfast that was gentle, not assertive, not heavy, the kind of thing made for a child who wasn't feeling well or for a Sunday morning that didn't need to prove anything. The balance of sweet and savory and the contrast in texture between the egg and the corn are things a trained cook would describe as intentional technique. The women who made it described it as what was in the skillet. Both descriptions are accurate.
Entry 17, fried green tomatoes at breakfast. Late summer, when the tomato plants were heavy with fruit that wasn't going to ripen before the cold came. Sliced thick, a ½ inch at least, pressed into seasoned cornmeal, fried in bacon fat until the crust was deep gold and the tomato inside had softened without losing its tartness or its shape. That tartness was the reason this appeared at breakfast and not just at supper. Fried green tomatoes cut through the richness of everything else on the plate, the eggs, the biscuit, the gravy, the way something acidic always cuts through fat. The person who developed this understood the plate as a composition, even if they never used that word. They were working with acidity and richness and texture, and they got it right, in a skillet before 8 in the morning without a culinary education. Entry 16, syrup bread. White bread, the enriched post-war variety that had become a staple by the early 1960s, with sorghum or cane syrup poured directly onto it. Not spread, poured, left to saturate the bread until it was heavy and sweet and slightly collapsed. Eaten with a fork or with the hands, depending on age and supervision. This was a weekday breakfast assembled in 30 seconds when school started in 40 minutes and there was no other available interval. It was not a meal anyone served to company. It sustained a child through a morning and required almost no preparation from a person who had already been up for 2 hours doing other things. The children who ate syrup bread before school in the 1960s grew up. They remember it without embarrassment. Some of them still make it. Entry 15, salt fish cakes. Salt cod or salt pollock soaked overnight to pull the brine out, then flaked and mixed with mashed potato and minced onion and beaten egg, formed into patties and fried until the exterior held firm and the interior stayed moist. Different from the salmon croquette in texture, softer inside, more delicate crust, and different in origin. This was a gullah geechee preparation from the coastal Carolinas and Georgia, where saltfish had been a dietary staple since before the Civil War, and where the cooking tradition that Black Americans built on the Sea Islands remained one of the most distinct and least documented culinary cultures in the country. When the Great Migration moved families north to Philadelphia and New York, saltfish cakes moved with them, assembled in apartment kitchens from ingredients available in any market, carrying a coastal tradition into cities that had no coast.
Entry 14. Pork chops and eggs. A thick pork chop, bone-in, real weight, seasoned with salt and black pepper and fried in cast iron until the edges charred and the meat cooked through. Eggs fried in the same pan in the drippings, white edges going crispy from the heat and the fat, yolks still soft. This was not a weekend breakfast in every household. A man going to work before sunrise and returning after dark needed this on a Wednesday. The person who made it understood the math of the day ahead and had the chop in the pan before he finished getting dressed. That understanding, what this particular body needed to do this particular work, was a form of knowledge that lived in the person doing the cooking, not in any recipe. When that person was gone, the knowledge went with them, unless someone had been paying attention. Entry 13. Fried apple rings with pork. Firm apples, wine sap, stamen, whatever the fall had produced, cored, sliced crosswise into thick rings, fried in the fat left in the pan after the morning's pork. A little sugar and cinnamon added to the pan. The apple absorbed the savory quality of the drippings, while the sugar caramelized against the iron, producing a ring that was sweet and savory at once, crispy at the edges, tender through. Laid alongside the pork on the plate with the pan syrup running across everything. The combination of salty, fatty pork and sweet, spiced apple predates by decades every sweet and savory pairing that appeared on a restaurant menu in the last 30 years. It was worked out in home kitchens by women processing fall fruit before it turned, using what the previous step had left in the pan, getting the answer right the first time. Entry 12. Milk toast. White bread, toasted, broken into pieces in a bowl, hot milk poured over it. Sometimes a little sugar, sometimes a pat of butter, sometimes a pinch of cinnamon. The bread softened in the milk and became something between soup and cereal, warming from the inside out. Milk toast was a specific category of food in the 1960s Black household, made for sick children, for elderly people with difficult digestion, for cold mornings when the body needed something that asked nothing of it. It was not a dish that sought to impress, it sought to restore. The distinction between a meal that nourishes and a meal that restores is one that the modern breakfast table has largely stopped making. Milk toast understood the difference clearly and was made accordingly.
Entry 11. Sweet milk cornbread. Sweet milk cornbread used whole fresh milk in place of buttermilk and added a touch of sugar to the batter, producing a crumb that was softer and slightly sweeter than the savory versions, appropriate for the morning table in a way the denser supper cornbread was not. Eaten warm from the skillet with butter melting into the cracks or crumbled into a glass of cold milk, the temperature contrast between the warm cornbread and the cold milk was its own small pleasure, arrived at by daily repetition rather than design. In the mid to late 1960s, sweet milk cornbread at breakfast represented something specific. You had milk, you had cornmeal, you had butter. Three things that together on a given morning meant the household had enough. That meaning was not incidental to the recipe. Entry 10. Persimmon pudding. The wild American persimmon is inedible before the first frost and one of the most complex fruits on the continent after it. Black families in rural South knew the difference precisely, picked the post-frost fruit, mashed the pulp through a sieve, and baked it in an iron skillet with eggs and butter and sugar and a little flour until it came out dense and dark and custardy, with a flavor between date and pear that exists nowhere else. Made in the fall in quantity, it sat on the back of the stove and was eaten for breakfast on cold mornings through November and into December. A wild harvest turned into a seasonal staple. Persimmon pudding survives now in a small number of households in Indiana, North Carolina, and Virginia. Outside of those, it has almost entirely disappeared, which is a loss that has no available substitute. Entry 9. Side meat and biscuits with sorghum. Side meat was salt-cured pork from the side of the hog, enough lean for texture, enough fat for flavor, fried until it curled at the edges and released its fat into the pan. Biscuits made from scratch with lard and buttermilk, cut with the mouth of a glass, baked until tall and golden. Sorghum syrup on the table. The choice, syrup on the biscuit alone, or the biscuit split, the side meat placed inside, the sorghum poured over the whole construction. Both were correct. This was the breakfast of the late 1960s in kitchens that had traveled from Mississippi and Alabama to Cleveland and Gary and Los Angeles, carried north in the muscle memory of women who made the trip with their hands already knowing what to do. The address changed. The biscuits did not.
Entry 8. Red-eye gravy on a biscuit. Red-eye gravy did not require country ham. It required a pan with drippings and a pot of strong black coffee. Whatever salt pork or streak of lean or side meat had been fried that morning left something in the cast iron, and strong black coffee poured directly into that hot pan produced a thin, dark, savory liquid with a coffee bitterness underneath the rendered fat. Not thick, not white. Poured over a split biscuit or over grits. The technique was the understanding that coffee and pork fat are not opposites, that the bitterness of one and the richness of the other produce a third thing that neither achieves alone. This was a working out that happened over many mornings in many kitchens, and it was correct. Correct enough that it required no revision for the better part of a century. Entry 7. Streak of lean and sawmill gravy over rice. Sawmill gravy was made fast and thick, coarser flour than white gravy, high heat, less time, and it was called sawmill gravy because it was the gravy of logging camps and sawmills, made for men doing the hardest work because it was quick and filling and had enough fat in it to run a body through a morning. By the 1960s, it had settled into black homes across the South as the gravy you made when time was short and thin was not acceptable. Poured over white rice rather than biscuits, the variation of the South Carolina and Georgia Low Country, where rice was the default starch, alongside streak of lean fried until curled. This breakfast felt like supper in its weight and depth, which was the intended effect. A breakfast that sat like supper was a breakfast that had done its job. Entry 6. Tomato gravy and biscuits. Tomato gravy is not ketchup. It was made in the skillet after the morning's meat came out. Fat left in the pan, flour added to make a quick roux, then crushed canned tomatoes or fresh stewed tomatoes and a little sugar and salt, cooked down until thick and red-orange and smooth. Poured over biscuits. The acidity of the tomato cut through the heaviness of the morning in a way that white gravy did not. It brightened the plate. As canned tomatoes became reliably available through the late 1960s, tomato gravy competed directly with white gravy at the morning table, and the household that chose tomato over white was making a statement about preference that was also a statement of identity. Both were correct. The preference was the point.
Entry 5. Fried okra at breakfast. Okra did not belong to a specific meal in the black Southern kitchen. It belonged to the garden and the skillet and whoever was hungry. Sliced into rounds, dredged in seasoned cornmeal, fried in hot oil until the crust was deep oiled and the interior tender, okra at breakfast appeared in the summer months when the garden was producing faster than supper could consume it. Eaten alongside eggs, alongside grits, or alone from a bowl at the kitchen counter because the person who made it had made too much and was not going to let it go cold. Fried okra before 8 in the morning is not an eccentric choice. It is a garden insisting on itself and a cook responding sensibly. The flavor makes the argument without assistance. Entry 4. Crackling and cush-cush. Kush was coarse cornmeal mixed with baking powder and salt, and just enough water to hold together, cooked in hot lard in a heavy skillet, broken into lumps and turned constantly until each piece was gold and crispy outside and soft inside, like fried cornmeal mash, like something between grits and hush puppies. Cracklings folded in before or on top after gave it smoke and salt and the rendered pork fat flavor that ran underneath most of the black Southern breakfast table. Eaten with cane syrup poured over or with whole milk alongside, Kush was a Cajun and Creole contribution that moved east and north with the people who made it and is now almost entirely gone from memory. The word itself, kush, is rarer than it deserves to be. The dish is rarer still. Entry 3. Molasses cake from the night before. Dense, dark, made with sorghum or blackstrap molasses and spiced with ginger and cinnamon, baked in a square pan the night before and on the breakfast table the next morning, not as a treat, as a staple. A thick slice with a cup of chicory coffee was a complete breakfast for a working person who needed to be out the door. Blackstrap molasses carried iron and minerals that bodies doing hard physical labor needed, and the women baking this cake understood its value without the language of nutrition science to name it. The cake did not photograph well. It tasted like the inside of a November morning. It has nearly disappeared from the morning table, and the loss is not only culinary. What it represented, food designed around what a body needed to do rather than around what was convenient to produce, is rarer now than the recipe.
Entry 2. Stewed prunes and canned biscuits. Stewed prunes, simmered in water with sugar and a strip of lemon peel until thick and dark and intensely sweet, occupied a specific role in the 1960s Black household. They were medicine and they were breakfast, and the line between those categories was not clearly drawn because the understanding was that food was supposed to do something for you. By the mid-1960s, canned refrigerator biscuits had become the weekday shortcut, while scratch biscuits were reserved for Sundays and company. The combination of warm canned biscuits from the oven and a bowl of stewed prunes belonged to the older members of the household. The grandparents ate this. The grandchildren, eating something else at the same table, watched and filed it away. Some of them are still carrying it. Entry 1. Big Mama's full Sunday breakfast plate. Entry 1 is not a single dish. It is what happened on Sunday morning when the week's individual breakfasts, the leftover rice, the hoe cakes, the fatback, the gravy, gave way to everything at once. Scratch biscuits still warm, fried chicken wings because the chicken went into the oil early, and breakfast chicken is different from supper chicken, even when the recipe is the same. Scrambled eggs cooked soft, stone-ground grits with butter, stewed fruit on the side, sometimes a slice of sweet potato pie from the night before, because no one had told Big Mama that pie was not appropriate before noon, and she had no interest in hearing it. The plate was not assembled to be admired. It was assembled to fortify people about to go into a church service that might last 3 hours and into a week that was going to require everything they had. The Sunday breakfast plate was preparation. It was the clearest statement the household made about what the people in it were worth. Not in words, in the weight of the plate, in the scratch biscuits instead of canned, in the chicken that went into the oil before anyone else was awake, in the pie, which had no business being there and was exactly right. These 41 breakfasts did not disappear because the recipes were lost. Recipes survive. What disappeared was the hour before sunrise and the person who chose to spend it in the kitchen before anyone asked her to. The cast iron is still at the store. The cornmeal is still on the shelf. What gets passed down waits. It does not expire.